Thanks for joining today for the Safe, Secure, Contactless Commerce keynote. My name is Eric Allen. I'm CEO of LISNR. LISNR leverages the power of Ultrasonic to create touchless commerce experiences. We primarily focus on proximity verification by helping merchants kind of authenticate and identify consumers in their payment flow. I'm going to pre-apologize. My setup is a little bit odd as I have a big screen, and so I'm trying to watch along while I present. So hopefully this doesn't feel a little bit too awkward. With that being said, I thought it would be good to start the presentation off with a few slides that shows the growth of contactless payment market and the role mobile has to play in that growth. Undoubtedly, COVID has been a huge catalyst for growth in the contactless payment market, so much that the contactless payment market growth projections, which were originally below 15%, have now increased to slightly above 20%, going from just over $1 trillion in 2019 to a projected $5.4 trillion in 2027. And while safety was a big driver for the adoption of contactless services, the needs of the pandemic have brought to surface the convenience and the efficiencies of these new contactless models. So we're now seeing a preference of digital wallets over physical wallets due to that convenience, ease of use, and as well as safety. In addition to the digital wallets, pre-order and prepay services such as buy online, pick up in store have also become the dominant consumer shopping experience. However, the adoptions of contactless models do not come without a price. Cost of the ecosystem and the changes required, transaction fees associated with the various services and networks. Many of these transactions are considered e-commerce transactions and therefore carry those tariffs. And then new forms of fraud have driven primarily by lack of standards within the ecosystem and the ecosystem support. But what you see here is a 20% growth, compound annual growth over that time period. This chart was pulled by the Mcommerce forecast 2021 by Insider Intelligence. And although Mcommerce will account for just under 6% of the total retail sales in the US in 2021, it's an important piece of the puzzle for retailers, as mobile is more than just about capturing conversions. It's really where discovery and buy decisions are made. With that being said, mobile conversion are becoming more and more critical for merchants. By 2025, it will be about 10% of the total contribution of retail sales. And note, while the number of mobile buyers did slightly grow during the pandemic, it barely grew above trend, which means in reality, most of the current users were using those buy options and converting more often than mobile. And this was really evident when you look at the breakdown of behavior in contactless e-commerce. Prior to the pandemic, you started to see those trends. For example, in Q1 2020, desktop was the dominant platform when you look at the actual e-commerce sales. However, the time spent searching and engaging in products or product discovery heavily favored mobile. And so the latter part of 2020 and what we're seeing in 2021, the trends are showing higher and higher mobile sale conversion. So what does that mean? And merchants really had to address or have to address these triggered trends by the pandemic. This meant enabling touchless services throughout the customer journey. This means customer journeys probably begins online and then converges offline. And that requires updates to several key points of service, such as mobile payment systems, pre-order systems, new forms of authentication, possibly inclusion and updates to existing loyalty programs, implementation of non-traditional platforms, I would include QR code as an example of that. More than likely a move to a software-centric solution versus possibly less reliance on hardware, especially as consumer behavior moved to more of a touchless model. Consumers showed a reluctance in engaging in hardware. That means cloud becomes more of a primary focus versus on-prem. And then real-time inventory, as online consumers and offline consumers are fighting for that same purchase capability or that same item that's on the offline shelf. So, how to approach the investment in touchless? I think it's important that you have to know your use cases. We've been working with a lot of merchants in this space, and we really focus on helping them understand, what are you trying to accomplish? What's the planned behavior? What does your customer journey look like? Really understanding what are the critical points of engagement, the details of that flow. How does the interactions between consumers and merchants happen within your environment, especially if you're having to extend that journey or extend that engagement outside of your traditional storefront. So therefore, how does mobile kind of play in that process? Then take in consideration you have regional requirements on privacy and data management. It all requires a lot of flexibility. So key is finding the gaps. Is it seamless for the consumer? Or do you have to point to consumers to signs and educate them, and they're having to tap, click, scan throughout that journey? And then are you able to verify payment or fulfillment adequately? You got to solve for those gaps, but you have to be realistic. Will customers utilize those solutions in an efficient way and secure ways? Will the customer spend large amounts of time adjusting their smartphones and trying to scan QR codes or invest their personal time in that process? That becomes pretty expensive, both for the merchant as well as the consumer. So one of the use case examples that we've been really focused on has been the buy online, pick up in store. This example has had a tremendous amount of growth during the pandemic for obvious reasons, especially being safety. It allows consumers to avoid crowds. But more importantly, while the initial kind of driver for adoption here was driven out of safety, what we're starting to see is consumers across a broad range of demographics really appreciate the convenience and flexibility of ordering from home or their mobile devices, and then that convenience of picking up those items when and whenever. Also in highly dense environments, maybe those products are in different locations, and so they have the ability to determine the locations in which they want to pick up those items. So, ultimately, it allows merchants to open up their inventory to the consumer and then offer that convenience. With that being said, it also is one of the kind of biggest, most fraudulent areas as far as the biggest growth in fraud, which I'll explain on the next slide. So while merchants are having success allowing them to drive product out the door, and we're seeing savvy merchants really cross-sell and expand kind of the basket size by focusing on loyalty and integrating loyalty and personalization into the experience. We're also seeing a huge pickup in fraud. And so businesses that kind of offered this option before 2020 saw a 70% increase in transaction volume and a 58% increase in transaction value in 2020, according to data from ACI worldwide. However, BOPIS fraud attempts grew to about 150% over other delivery channels. So when you walk through kind of this flow that we kind of outlined here, there's a lot of good things, right? And so you have selection and payment process for the most part has been good. I think items are easy to select. There's convenience on the consumer to use, whether it's their iPad, their mobile device, or a laptop. For the most part, the credit cards are secure on the various online platforms. We've heard some of the stories and possibly experienced some of the breaches, but for the most part, I think merchants do a decent job here. The communication services are pretty good. There's leveraging text or email notifications through the app, usually helping communicate with the consumer, updates as these orders are progressing through the cycle. However, there are a few gaps, and for all the good, a few of those gaps can have a negative impact. In a short amount of time, you really have to realize that in that fulfillment phase, you have to authenticate that user, and possibly you have to authenticate that consumer device during that pickup. And then while you're authenticating user device, again, authenticating or validating that transaction. So that's where there's a few gaps. The current BOPIS model do little to ensure that the customer is authorized to actually receive that order. This includes validation that users are present and were approved the original transaction request. In some cases, the merchant attendee may check names or phone numbers. You probably had maybe even vehicle descriptions as an entry point through that experience. Some cases, such as evasive as requiring driver license. However, these checks are only really confirming the buyer who entered that purchase information is the person picking up those items. So if the original source request was bad, then all you're doing is really authenticating a bad actor. There's been a number of cases where fraud, especially identity fraud, was stolen, and then credit cards were used to actually execute these transactions. And then you've seen other modalities such as QR codes be used at the edge to help simplify that process. But even in those scenarios, you have a pain point with Curbside, especially the example where for some reason a QR code doesn't scan. Now you're putting additional pressure on the edge of that fulfillment, trying to have the attendee solve for in real time that failed QR code or invalid QR code scan. So what we lay out is really trying to identify within the cycle, where is possibly the weak point, and what does that mean? So like here, the user experience in the order process is highly desirable for everyone. You have convenience, you have efficiency, you have typically broader selection. But if the authentication is adequate, then that experience continues through the positive cycle, and you wind up getting, as we saw in the growth projections, more and more users using those platforms and services to continue to procure services. And through that process, you build brand loyalty as consumers adopt your wallet, and you have the ability to now personalize and provide forms of recommendation. However, if you have a scenario where you've gone through that purchase and you didn't really secure the person's authentication at pickup, now the impact is pretty severe. So merchants have obviously loss of revenue, but beyond the loss of revenue, you have to deal with different forms of fraud and chargebacks. And the chargeback cost can be up to 3 times the original price of the chargeback when you start to factor in inventory, restocking, and shipping as part of that example. So once you have that, or once your consumers have that one negative experience, there's a higher propensity for them to shop elsewhere. So we laid out from our experience some of the best practices. especially to secure that authentication. So merchant backend have to initiate the process at purchase for store authentication. We also think it's important that you provision on the client device and have some form of provisioning mechanism for pickup. In many of these use cases, the mobile wallet or merchant wallet is used on the consumer side to facilitate and to initiate that pickup. One method is to tokenize that experience. So tokenization of the provisioned devices, we think is a critical point for authentication at pickup. For LISNR, the issuance of proximity tokens to the client and the store device is a extremely secure way of being able to achieve that. So secure the association between both the client and the store via that proximity token allows for the validation of both consumer and the merchant during the completion of that transaction. The next slide, I'll go into a little bit more detail of kind of how we can achieve that. So, LISNR's ultrasonic authentication with secure device association is essentially a methodology or a platform that allows us, as a matter of fact, the narrative on the right-hand side is, you see two devices that represent one, the consumer holding the merchant wallet app, and the merchant attendee app on the right-hand side that represents the merchant acceptance device. And through LISNR's tokenization services, which also is an integration with network tokens, LISNR can validate at the time of pickup consumer ownership of the device with the proximity token that validates both consumer and merchant were physically present at the time of the transaction. One of the critical goals here is that we do the association of user to device to possible card on file or digital card used to initiate and or authorize that payment. And then that device associated with transaction along with the association of merchant, all happening in a single process. So in conclusion, LISNR's SDK provides a non-captive, secure offline transaction interconnect that uses the mobile device audio components to create a secure communication between devices. Because we use standard audio components, we enable these authentications to happen up to 6 feet and beyond. So to learn more about our platform, definitely either send questions or you can go to our website, LISNR.com, or reach out to me at eric@LISNR.com. And thank you.